We're being attacked. It's an air raid.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941, here dramatically shot by Japanese film crews for propaganda purposes, not only crippled America's Pacific fleet, it changed the course of history. Just the day before the raid, President Roosevelt had personally appealed to Emperor Hirohito not to drag their two countries into war. But it was too late. Japan had formed a secret pact with Germany to attack the Allied forces in Europe and in the Far East. America at that stage was neutral, but generally sympathetic to the Allied cause. This was an attempt to destroy American military power in the Pacific before she could strike back.
Hello, laddies and gentlemen, goys and girls. This is Julius Chambers and Sir Softarm with the Pearl Harbor Day podcast. And by the way, Softarm isn't a penis joke. Everyone thinks it's a penis joke. I don't know why. I guess it sounds flaccid or whatever. But
yeah, it's like an impotence thing. No, it's not.
It's because his hands were literally soft as a child. So that's why we say that. It's kind of weird, but anyway. So Softy, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Julius.
Yeah. So you're part Japanese, and so how much responsibility, if any, do you have for Pearl Harbor itself? I guess that's kind of like Christ and the Jews. It's like, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, the Catholic Church's official position on collective responsibility.
I guess depending on who you ask, it could be either no responsibility or the entire responsibility. So, yeah, I guess that's how it is. But anyway, so your grandpa was actually interred in one of those internment camps in Heart Mountain, which is in Wyoming. And he was actually in a camp with George Takei, that Star Trek actor.
Actually, it was my grandma who was with George Takei.
Really? Oh, your grandpa wasn't?
Yeah.
Oh, well, anyway, same thing. Grandpa, grandma.
Other grandparent. Yeah, they're the same, basically.
Yeah, well, I guess he wouldn't Me Too her, so I guess she was safe.
She was like 5.
And I guess, Italians apparently were in the internment camps too, because out in the ones in New York, those filthy Italians, I'm half Italian, so I wasn't able to claim reparations, but I mean, I think Japanese got like a $20,000 check per person who had been in the camps, and obviously they lost all their assets, so I mean it was nothing compared to what a lot of people lost, but yeah, Italians actually were.
I don't know the exact amount, but yeah, there were payments.
Yeah, I think Ronnie Reagan made that payment. Yeah, but and FDR took away the assets. Yeah. But yeah, Italians I guess went to the mostly Montana. There was a camp there, and then there was a few others. But yeah, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, and the U.S. of course was worried about espionage and things of that sort at the time. And apparently a general, John DeWitt, took it to the extreme. And that's why you had so many people on the West Coast who were, especially Japanese, but some Italians too, who were put into internment camps, whereas in the East Coast, not so much. But most of the Japanese lived on the West Coast, and the West Coast is, of course, closer to Japan. So it kind of, while it was unjust, it kind of makes sense that they'd be more on edge about that part of the country. But,
yeah, no, I believe the actual words or the executive order says something like it authorizes any actions to be taken to ensure the security of like areas essential for national defense or something like that. And so that it said, yep, that's all of Washington, all of Oregon, all of California.
yeah. I mean Hawaii. Yeah, that's maybe a little bit different story, but yeah, the Western U.S.
They didn't do internments in Hawaii because Japanese Americans were like 50% of the population, something like that. Like,
right. Even today,
possibly do that.
Even today, like all the senators and half the population or more is Japanese and some Filipinos. So yeah, that's still true today. But so your grandfather, if you could just briefly mention that, you were saying that he was put into an internment camp, and it really wasn't that much different than regular. I mean, it was probably shitty conditions, right? But like in some ways,
Yeah, but they were allowed to go about their regular routines and stuff, just in a prison basically.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah, basically, yeah, the government came around one day, slapped signs all over the neighborhood, and said, yeah, by tomorrow morning, or whatever, you better all people of Japanese descent, regardless of whether or not U.S. citizens, go to a bus stop with one bag, and we're shipping you off to God knows where.
Right, yeah. A lot of them didn't, they were from the West Coast, and they went out to this like barren region of Wyoming, which I think is actually considered desert, but it's like, it's like this tundra or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I guess when
so initially their family was temporarily housed in the stables at a horse race track before being shipped out to the middle of the desert or whatever in Wyoming.
Yeah. Right. And then you said when they got out, they basically just like got a bus ticket and they can go wherever they want, right?
Yeah, basically they say, here's a train, they'll buy you a train ticket for anywhere you want to go in the country. Have fun with that.
Yeah.
At least it's better than what they did with the Japanese in Canada, where they split up families in camps by gender, then when the war was over, they just let them loose and didn't provide transportation or money or anything. Just like, yeah, bye.
Yeah, I think in Canada they treated them like even more subhumanly, from what I was reading. So it was even worse.
It was also way more like racially motivated in Canada than the United States.
Right.
Because a lot of people in the British Columbia and stuff felt that their a lot of like fishermen especially felt that their livelihoods were being threatened by competition from Japanese immigrants.
Right, yeah.
The RCMP actually did a examination before the war and determined that there was no threat whatsoever from the Japanese living there.
Yeah.
And these angry people were just like, get rid of them.
Right. And even today, Canada is mostly white, and nothing says white soy boy like Justin Trudeau. So. So yeah, right. But anyway, yeah, and your grandparents then they maybe like drifted around the western U.S. for a while before they ended up in the Midwest, right? Is that true?
I believe they actually both moved to with their families, moved to the Midwest after they got pretty much right after they got out of the camp, so that they didn't end up here right away.
Yeah. Okay. So there was actually, as far as the concern over espionage and rebellion of the Japanese American population, generally that wasn't going to be the case, but there's this one incident that happened in Hawaii that you were telling me about earlier, where actually a Japanese serviceman, some sort of fighter pilot, I guess, was either crashing or had some sort of incident where his plane was down, sort of like John McCain or one of these war heroes in the U.S., like a similar thing. And then the Japanese people living in Hawaii, who, as you said, were like 50% of the population, they actually like helped him out, right? Is that true? Here.
So, yeah. So this one fighter pilot, his Zero fighter was damaged over Pearl Harbor, and he did an emergency landing on the island of Niihau, which I believe is one of the smallest and last islands in the Hawaiian chain.
Yeah.
Which I believe at the time was actually entirely private property, the entire island.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, some guy was like trying to raise sheep or something on it, but but anyways, yeah, and so I believe the Japanese beforehand had actually arranged they told the pilots, if any of your planes are damaged, you can't make it back to the carriers, land here and we'll pick you up with a submarine a few days later.
Oh.
That didn't work out, but anyway, so yeah, he landed there. This pilot landed there, and he discovered that there were probably a few dozen people living there. Most of them were Hawaiian, but there were also a couple Japanese immigrants living there. Mm-hmm. And he approached them and to see if they would help him out. And I believe this is the only case throughout the entire war in the entire country of actually Americans assisting the Japanese in any way. Mm-hmm. And it was on literally the first day of the war. And it was 2 people.
Oh, really?
Anyways,
okay.
The Hawaiians living there got wind of this, and eventually they rounded up the Japanese guy and locked him in a house until the property owner would come the property owner would regularly visit the island on a boat every week or so, and they were just so they're gonna just lock this guy up till the the landowner came and they'd hand him off, and he'd take him back to the bigger islands where he'd be handed over to the government.
Yeah. When you had mentioned that, it's like the first I'd heard of that. But it's not talked about a lot in popular media. But yeah.
Yes. But anyways, so this one Japanese man living there and his wife got their hands on some guns, including like the pilot's sidearm and I think like a shotgun the man owned, and busted this pilot out and tried to escape back to his crashed plane. And they burned his code books and stuff, and they actually tried to pull a machine gun off the plane. Although I don't think you can use a plane machine gun just like that. But anyways, the Hawaiians on the island started to overpower them, and I believe they all killed themselves because they like that sort of thing.
Oh my God!
And then another interesting fact as to this is the guy's plane was in pretty good shape, and for the first couple of years of the war, the Navy was really interested in getting their hands on like an intact Zero, so they could study it and determine what its strengths and weaknesses were, and so that they could better counter them.
Could you explain what that is to people who don't know? I actually don't know.
Explain what?
What did you say? A Zero?
Weaknesses. Yeah, the Zero fighter.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear what you said.
Mitsubishi A6M Type Zero carrier fighter, if you want me to be really anal about it.
That's okay, yeah.
But anyways, yeah. Eventually, they found one crashed on the island of Akutan in Alaska. That they very thoroughly studied, and that gave us a lot of information to develop new fighters that could better counter the Zero. But anyways, when I first saw about this incident, it occurred to me that, man, why didn't they study this fighter? This is the first day of the war. They've already got their hands on like a really intact Zero. Well, it turns out that after the Japanese guy escaped, the Hawaiians, while looking for him, decided, no, we're going to burn his plane so he can't fly away with it. So they torched his almost intact plane. I'm like, oh, so close.
Oh my God. That's interesting. Yeah, speaking of Zero, yeah, I mean, I guess that's like the anime Code Geass. Not really.
Not at all.
But anyway. Yeah, so yeah, that story isn't really repeated often, but it's pretty interesting that there was, some...
When I read about this, I couldn't believe I'd never heard of it before. It seems like it would be a famous thing. That's a big happening.
Right.
I mean, it was a small event, but the implications are enormous.
Was there anything else like that occurred in the mainland that you know of?
No, nothing. Absolutely nothing.
Right, yeah. So I mean, I guess the Japanese generally were loyal to their new country for the most part.
Except these two scumbags in Nihao.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and so maybe I'll talk a little bit about what, like, leading up to the war. Like, there was a lot of speculation during the war that FDR, or like before the war, that FDR wanted a war. In 1940, he actually moved the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to Pearl Harbor, and they were secretly building submarines that were capable of invading Japan in the U.S. And there was something like 50 destroyers given to Britain to fight in the German part of the war. The German part was not very connected to the Japanese portion, but it was clear that FDR was biased towards the Anglosphere and wanted to help the British as much as possible. He supported the Allies with the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, which gave funds loans that did not need to be repaid to the British and also to the Soviet Union, who was really the heavy lifter during the war, probably even more so.
And also to the Chinese.
Right. Yeah, he also gave to the Chinese. There was a 1940 draft of soldiers, despite the fact that the war was not even there was no war declared at that point, but yet they gave these they had some sort of draft, and the Soviets first got their military aid in 1941. The U.S. transported fighter planes to the British in the Mediterranean also in 1941, and in August 1941, the embargo of Japan, as a result of the Japanese invading Manchuria and parts of China, was encouraged Japan to withdraw from China, and Japan got like 90% of its oil. I think 95% of its oil from the United States. So
yeah, I've read 80%.
Yeah,
But either way, it's a
so
substantial
basically
fraction.
it like destroyed it like cornered Japan into having to fight because of the fact that they got like a ton of their resources, including oil, from the U.S. and they were using China to get additional resources, but they still needed oil. So,
And actually, even before that, in 1940, the United States put an embargo on scrap metal to Japan.
oh right.
And also closed off the Panama Canal to Japanese flagship vessels.
Yeah, and that's a huge step in isolating.
And then in July 41 as well, they froze all Japanese assets.
Oh really? That's interesting. Yeah. Oh yeah, I think I heard that too. Yeah, that's true. And then also U.S. bombers began to move to the Philippines in 1941, like shortly after the embargo, because I guess FDR and apparently in a poll like 52% of Americans or something like that were expecting a war. So. I guess people. I mean, so to some extent, a war was sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, but to another extent, FDR was sort of like, positioning people and isolating Japan in such a way that it was like an angry animal, being cornered, and there would have to be some kind of confrontation, most likely. So that's
By the time of the embargo, essentially all attempts at negotiation had failed, and actually there had been quite a lot series of negotiations. The Japanese agreed they would partake in no further aggression against the Western powers, provided that the Western powers stopped providing aid to the Chinese and things like that. Mm-hmm. But in the end, the United States demanded complete and unconditional withdrawal from China.
Right.
And the Japanese couldn't have that. Anyway, and then it's reached a climax with the embargo of oil to Japan, and that really put a chokehold on Japan because their strategic reserves were only enough for another couple years of fighting.
Right. Yeah.
They needed that oil, and there was a source of oil nearby in the Dutch East Indies.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. President Suharto extracted that in the 1980s, but yeah, that's true. Yep.
And also rubber in Malaya and again in the Dutch East Indies, and so they need oil to run a modern industrial country and their modern industrialized war effort,
mm-hmm.
and faced with an embargo from the United States, their only other option was to go to the Dutch East Indies,
right.
But if you look at a map, you look at a line from Japan and you go down to the Dutch East Indies, what you have to do is you have to pass the Philippines, and the Philippines were controlled by the U.S.
Yeah, at the time it was a colony still. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And the Japanese were very aware of the fact that the U.S. didn't like what they were doing, obviously, from all the threatening moves. And they feared that if they took action against the Dutch, their supply lines, their shipping lanes from Japan to their new oil reserves in the Dutch East Indies would be vulnerable to attack by the Americans. Mm-hmm. Whenever the Americans decided they would intervene if the Americans decided at some point they would intervene in the war, and so in order to secure that, they would have to invade the Philippines as well, because
absolutely. Even China
reserves.
Even China struggles with that. The fact that there are U.S. military bases in South Korea and Japan and the mm-hmm. Philippines and Taiwan today. So that's still a problem in Asia today. And apparently there was even negotiations and talks between the Japanese and the U.S. all the way up until the day of Pearl Harbor. So I guess they thought that there could be some hope of a breakthrough, but they sort of knew what was coming, I think, right?
Yeah. In fact, there was this incident which some people incorrectly state as a Japanese declaration of war. It was a message that was intended that was sent to the Japanese embassy in Washington D.C., intended to be delivered to the U.S. government 30 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And like I said, many people claim that this was a Japanese declaration of war. It wasn't. It actually stated that the Japanese government stated that the negotiations had failed. Mm-hmm. And that war was a possibility.
Huh. But they basically knew that they were going to go to war anyway. Yeah.
Yes, but this message, it was a very long message, and it took a while for the Japanese embassy to decode it and transcribe it and stuff. And actually, it took them longer to decode and transcribe it than U.S. intelligence. So actually, the U.S. code breakers actually decoded the message faster than the Japanese who were intended to receive it. But as a result, instead of being delivered 30 minutes before the attack began, it was delivered about an hour after the attack began.
I see. So, I guess the Japanese have always been a proud people, and you've mentioned something about how the de-escalation of the war could have been seen as surrender. Could you talk about that briefly? Or,
obviously, as it became clear later on in the war, the Japanese really would not take a step back.
I thought you meant at the beginning of the war, but you mean like later on in the war?
It would. The Japanese couldn't afford to back down.
Right. Yeah, they pretty much
both from a political standpoint, from an economic standpoint, from a military standpoint.
And that's sort of the same with like the battle in China, right? They didn't want to just back down with regard to sacrificing the colonies, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, in terms of like how the U.S. and Japan matched up, the Japanese had quite a bit less capacity than the Americans. Is that correct?
I mean, you're talking about industrial capacity, yeah.
But also forces?
Substantially less. Japan has a pretty sizable population.
Mm-hmm.
On paper, if you compare the military to like a Western army, it really doesn't add up well.
Right. Yeah.
But their army was actually fairly well suited for fighting in the conditions that they fought in.
Mm-hmm.
Some of their equipment wasn't the best, but overall their army was like well suited to fighting in China and stuff. Like, for example, the Japanese army didn't carry very much artillery with them. Didn't have much artillery attached to the units, especially compared to like the Germans, for example. But when you put that in context of China at the time had the infrastructure in China was just terrible.
Right.
Anything that wasn't the big cities immediate along the coast had like roads that are all just dirt and stuff, and if you can't be hauling huge amounts of supplies and stuff across those terrain.
Mm-hmm. Even today, yeah, a lot of the Tibetan region and the central region is not developed in China. Yeah, it's still true today.
Yeah. If you look at maps of like the maximum extent of the Japanese occupation into China, you can see there's sort of like these tentacles reaching in from the coast, and those are following the main railroads because that's really the only way the Japanese could transport any large quantities of supplies.
Right.
Because everything outside the railways was just like a swamp.
And I think they even had trouble administering it because I know that they made the former Chinese emperor, who was the last emperor of China before World War II. What was that?
Puyi.
Yeah, they made him the commander or the governor or whatnot in charge of, I think, Manchuria after.
Yeah, they set him up at the head of their puppet government in Manchuria.
Yeah, and so that's interesting. I guess they, and it's hard to control any like large region like that. I guess in Korea they were able to stamp out a lot of the native culture in order to take that over, and
they actually made a concerted effort to erase Korean culture and replace it with Japanese culture.
Right. They just like completely tried to obliterate it. Yeah. And we kind of like the U.S. today.
Yeah.
But so yeah, that's how they were able to control that a little bit more easily. But in China, maybe it's a little bit more difficult. But do you want to go and talk about the attack itself at this point?
Okay, so the Japanese, like any respectable military, it made plans in advance for a potential operation against the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And previously in November 1940, actually the Royal Navy conducted a strike on the Italian fleet, the Italian Navy, the Regia Marina,
mm-hmm.
or I can't speak Italian. However you say that.
Baba di Bupi. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, Baba di Bupi in the harbor at Taranto, not Toronto, Taranto.
Oh, this is in Italy.
It's in Italy. Anyways, they had one carrier with 21 torpedo bombers, and they attacked the anchored Italian fleet at night, and they heavily damaged 3 Italian battleships.
Wow. Or the Japanese
so the Japanese studied this attack a lot because it, I mean, they obviously took inspiration for their operations based on that. Especially because the Japanese
the Americans
really,
launched that attack. You were saying?
No, the Royal Navy launched this attack
I see.
on the Italian Navy in November of 1940, and the Japanese studied this attack.
Right. Yeah.
And based their plans upon this idea of using torpedo bombers to attack a fleet at anchor.
Supposedly there was an area of Japan, I think it's somewhere in southern Japan. There was a bay that was shaped very similar to Pearl Harbor, with the narrow channel and the open bay in Oahu, I think, where it is, and they practiced dive bombing that in Japan before they actually launched their attacks in the U.S.
Yes, their pilots did a lot of practice to make sure this mission went right, because this was they basically had to get this right. The idea was to just crush the American fleet, and if you screw up, then you're in big trouble, because now those ships are coming for you. So.
Yeah, and why was it so difficult for the U.S. to detect it? Just like not adequate radar or not adequate systems developed at that point?
I mean, there were a number of reasons. Part of it was just inadequate communication. One somewhat well-known incident is the fact that there actually was a radar station in Hawaii that actually did pick up the incoming Japanese attack. But they were expecting a flight of B-17s coming in from California from roughly the same direction at roughly the same time. And so when they reported it up, when these radar operators reported it up the chain of command, the officers above them said, "Oh yeah, that must just be the B-17s coming in."
Mm-hmm. Oh, and right.
There was a bit of miscommunication there, because obviously the blip on the radar was way larger than a handful of B-17s coming in, because there were like 100 planes, but.
Yeah, and some of those U.S. B-17s, I believe, were caught up in the fire of friendly fire during the Pearl Harbor attack, because everything was so chaotic too.
Yeah, there were more than a few friendly fire incidents following the attack.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and although, I mean, even if the message had gotten out from these radar guys, I don't know how much good it would have done, because the attack was minutes away at the most.
Mm-hmm. You say in the literature that you gave me that the planes and the ships were placed in such a way that sabotage was, or to avoid being sabotaged, but they made easier targets. I think some of them were actually being inspected, and their hatches were open and things like that. Is that what you're referring to? So for example, normally on like an airfield, you would have all your fighters and bombers and stuff spaced out around the edges of the airfield. Mm-hmm. Such that if there was an attack on the airfield, all the planes aren't sitting right together. Right.
They can't take all the planes at once. But it also makes them harder to guard if they're spread out. And so they thought, well, our biggest threat is clearly Japanese saboteurs sneaking in here. So we're gonna cluster all the planes together in the center of the airfield, so they're easier to guard. But unfortunately, that also meant that, first of all, since they're all clumped together, it's harder to unpack them to get them to take off. Mm-hmm. And also, obviously, one bomb in the right place could blow them all up. Similarly, with the battleships, you might have seen pictures of the so-called battleship row. They had all the battleships clustered together along one side of Ford Island, which made them much easier to target.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. I think some of them, like I said, were even being inspected, so it made them, or they were off, like they weren't like fortified in such a way or prepared. Were they armed? Do you know that? Did the ships have like cannons? Were they like loaded?
They were all armed, but they weren't. They weren't at battle stations or anything. It was a Sunday morning and during peacetime.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of preparations that didn't go, like a lot of countries at the time would use so-called torpedo nets, which as the name implies, they would be nets you'd place around your ships that would, in theory, catch torpedoes to prevent them before they'd strike your ships. Now, these probably wouldn't have actually helped very much against a high-speed modern torpedo, but the fact they didn't do it shows a certain complacency, and also because they believed that the harbor was too shallow for an aerial torpedo, because if you drop a torpedo from a plane, you know, it's got that vertical momentum. It's gonna sink down in the water a bit before it bobs back up to its normal depth.
Right.
And so they thought, you know, if you drop a torpedo from a plane, it's just gonna stick itself into the harbor bottom.
Oh, I see.
But the Japanese accounted for this, and they practiced techniques to, first of all, fly very low to the water so the torpedo wouldn't be falling as fast when it hit the water. And they also modified the torpedoes a bit to operate properly in the shallow waters of the harbor. And then other missed preparations, for example, or the Army's anti-aircraft guns. You know, Pearl Harbor is a major military installation. You'd have a lot of anti-aircraft guns there to defend against an attack. But in this case, they didn't deploy most of them. They had a lot of anti-aircraft guns, but most of them were not actually spread out around the base and deployed. They were still sitting at the armory, partially because a lot of the area around the base is all private property, so they didn't want to piss off the local landowners, didn't want to cause panic by showing that, you know, by readying themselves for combat, essentially, because that's going to make people think, oh, geez, are we going to be attacked? Because the army clearly is getting ready for it.
Mm-hmm. And they used I guess I wasn't completely clear on this until I looked into it. It was mostly planes that dropped these torpedoes, but were there ships as well involved in the attack?
So the Japanese did sneak a couple midget submarines into the harbor, but they achieved nothing whatsoever except getting their crews killed. And actually, one of them ended up beaching itself on some beach in Hawaii, and the two men inside became the first Japanese prisoners of war.
Yeah, one of them died, and one of them was taken for questioning, I believe.
I think that was it.
Yeah, and so it was almost entirely an aerial attack and not really anything in the water. I hadn't really realized that, I guess, in the past. I think a lot of people don't realize that. But and also the whole island was under attack. Not just the ships and everything else, but the planes, as you were saying, and even like civilian homes. And the U.S. government, I believe, also was shelling its own citizens' homes, like, because there was chaos and friendly fire and B-17s being shot down, and I think there was something between 7 and 9 of them that were shot down on the U.S. side by their own soldiers. So, and do you think that Japan could have successfully launched a land invasion of Hawaii if they had wanted to?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. The U.S. was very concerned about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So there were some within the Japanese command that wanted this, but looking back on it, it never would have worked out. I mean, the Japanese were at the very limit of the logistical capabilities, getting the 6 aircraft carriers out there of the combined fleet for the strike. The Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku.
Right, because they have to go all the way from Japan. Yeah, and there's no.
Yeah, they brought eight oil tankers with them to refuel the ships along the way. And even then, they were really at the limits of their logistical capability. Just getting the ships, just to get them within airstrike range. And now that's hundreds of miles out too. Right. You're not even going all. And then if you brought troop ships too, and then plus your warships that have to hang around to support them, and you could end up in a situation where your ships are now stuck in Hawaii because you don't have enough fuel to get back to Japan.
Mm-hmm. Why was there no third wave attack? I know that there were 2 waves of attacks. Why did they call it off, the third wave?
So, well, if you look at the attack, the first wave they lost 9 planes, and the second wave they lost 20 planes.
Oh, I see.
So clearly the defense was getting stronger. And they had believed they had achieved their main objectives. They did not want the extra risk. Plus, the longer the aircraft carriers hang around, the more likely they'd be the Americans could attack them. And the Japanese did not know where any of the Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers were. And so they were also at risk from being attacked by American aircraft carriers. Didn't know where they were. And in fact, the USS Enterprise was actually very close to Pearl Harbor at the time. She sailed into Pearl Harbor that evening.
I see. And the only ships that survived the Japanese attack were the Arizona and Utah. Is there any reason for that? that you know of?
No, those are the only two that were, those are the only two that are still there in Pearl Harbor to this day.
I misunderstood that. Or how many ships survived the attack?
Right. So if you look at the battleships that were in Pearl Harbor, you have that were in Pearl Harbor that day. You have the USS Arizona, which was hit by 4 armor-piercing bombs. It suffered a magazine detonation and ripped the ship apart.
I see.
Over 1,000 U.S. sailors were killed, and that ship is still there to this day.
Did they ever get the
as a
troops
memorial.
out? Did they ever get the troops out of there, or the people stuck in the bottom?
The bodies,
or did they ever get them out alive? Any of them out alive? Or?
I mean, some people got out alive,
but most of them drowned.
Not a lot.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, continue. Sorry.
And there's still. I mean, the ship is a war grave. There's still bodies inside that were never retrieved.
Right.
And then you have the USS Oklahoma, which was hit by 2 torpedoes and capsized. It was righted and refloated, but was deemed too damaged to be repaired. You have the USS West Virginia, which is hit by 2 bombs and 7 torpedoes and was sunk, but was repaired and returned to service in July of 44.
I see.
You have USS California, which was hit by 2 bombs and 2 torpedoes and was sunk, but was returned to service in January of 44. You have the Nevada, which was hit by 6 bombs and 1 torpedo and beached to stop it from sinking, which was repaired by October 42. Pennsylvania, which was in dry dock at the time, so it wasn't in the water. It was hit by 1 bomb and was immediately put back into service. You have Tennessee, which was hit by 2 bombs and returned to service in February 42, and Maryland, also hit by 2 bombs and returned to service in February 42.
So a lot of these ships did in fact see combat in World War II later on.
Almost all of them were repaired.
Nice.
And then you mentioned before the Utah. The Utah was an older battleship that, as part of one of the interwar naval treaties, had been stripped of its main armaments and converted into an anti-aircraft gun training ship, and that was also sunk, and not recovered. But that was it had negligible military value.
So the ships that survived the attack, were they just lucky, or was that the reason for it? Or
so you see, there's a big difference between sinking a ship in the open ocean and sinking a ship in a shallow harbor.
Right.
Because if you sink a ship in the open ocean, there's no way you can salvage it. But you sink it in the harbor, there's still bits of the ship sticking out.
True.
It's not even fully underwater.
Oh, right. Yeah. So I guess ultimately, even if they, I guess. Some people survived, some people died, but in terms of the ships themselves being salvageable, yeah, they're going to be able to get them out to some extent because it is a shallow.
And almost all of the sunk battleships returned to service and got their revenge on the Japanese, so to speak. In fact, Admiral Chester Nimitz shortly after the attacks said, quote, "It was God's mercy that our fleet was in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, because he believed that if the Admiral Kimmel there had known of the Japanese attack, he would have sailed out to meet them with his battleships, and then they would have been attacked by the Japanese carrier aircraft and sunk in open water, and they would have been lost forever, and many more sailors would have been killed as well."
I see. And you were gave me something that said that the leadership of, is it the U.S., was somewhat paranoid about the attack? Is that what you were referring to?
I was, but that meant their sort of preparations, how they were paranoid about attack from within, sabotage, the way they'd grouped all their ships and airplanes together, rather than concern themselves with the obviously greater threat of attack from the outside.
I see. So they didn't even really expect the Japanese to really be that beastly in terms of, risking it all to go all the way out to the Pearl Harbor and bomb, right?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very audacious mission by the Japanese. In fact, they even purposely sailed a slightly longer route to get to Hawaii from Japan just to avoid the shipping lanes to maintain secrecy.
Oh, I see. Wow, that's difficult to do, especially with 2 tankers that you're carrying.
And 8 tankers.
Oh, 8 tankers. Oh, wow. That's a lot.
They had a big fleet, a really big fleet. It was a pretty substantial portion of the Japanese fleet. And that's also why they really couldn't hang around to take a whole lot of risks, because if something went wrong, they've just lost a huge portion of their fleet.
And the real question is, who refuels the tankers? Oh. I guess they would just have to let them go, or is that what it is?
What do you mean?
The tankers, or could they refuel themselves? Out of curiosity.
I assume they could. I don't know.
I guess, yeah, I don't know. Huh.
Yeah.
And so the shipbuilding numbers are interesting to look at. So the United States.
Yeah. So a lot of people think that talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor. A lot like to talk about the third wave. Why they didn't do the third wave, and the fact that they didn't target the naval facilities in Pearl Harbor, the dry docks, and most specifically the oil storage tanks, because the U.S. operations in the Pacific could have been set back for months, maybe even years, if the Japanese had taken out the oil depots in Pearl Harbor.
Right.
And while this is true, in the long run, it's not really relevant. None of this is relevant because the Japanese were going to lose no matter what happened once they started a war with America. And that's where we get into the shipbuilding numbers, as you mentioned. And not even just military shipbuilding, but merchant ships, for the logistics, to get to move your soldiers around, to move their ammo around, to move the fuel around, to move the food around, the bullets, all that stuff. Like, over the course of World War II, right, or like 1939 through 1945, Japan produced about 4 million tons of merchant shipping.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, on the other hand, produced 34 million tons of merchant shipping. And it doesn't matter how good your army is, it doesn't matter how big your army is. If you can't supply them with guns, if you can't supply them with food, if you can't supply them with water, if you can't get them where they need to go, they are utterly worthless. And that's what the Japanese really, really had a disadvantage of the Americans. Just couldn't get the supplies to their troops. So as the war went on, especially, the Americans would, in some instances, just starve out the Japanese defenders on these islands instead of trying to do a costly invasion of these heavily defended islands. They would just stop the supplies from getting there and just starve them out.
Yeah, that's quite a bit like what happened in the Civil War, except on a much smaller scale, where the industrial power and the manpower and the railroad system of the Union Army was much superior to the Confederates, even though the Confederates were quite skilled in battle. And I guess that this is just the same, or not the same, but similar on a larger scale, with regard to a big industrial powerhouse going up against a sort of an island nation that was trying to extract resources from China and the Asian continent, which is not difficult, which was difficult when, as you were saying, China was not that developed at the time as well. So,
yeah. And another aspect of the logistical problems of Japan is how Japan and the United States deployed their submarines. Japan envisioned their submarines to be used as part of like their combat fleet. They believe submarines were for sinking naval vessels, not merchant shipping, whereas the U.S. deployed their submarines quite actively in hunting Japanese merchant shipping. And as a result, that took an enormous toll on Japan's already limited availability of merchant ships.
Oh, I see. So that made their ship capacity even less, right? Yeah.
And on the other side of the coin as well, as far as escorting merchant ships, Japan never invested anywhere near the resources into escort ships for their merchant convoys as the U.S. did. I mean, part of this could be seen as because the U.S. had already made a huge investment into it for the Atlantic theater. They had developed technologies with the British and strategies and techniques for defending and convoys against submarines. And the Japanese didn't build a lot of escort vessels. They certainly didn't put a whole lot into trying to develop better techniques for hunting Japanese or hunting American submarines and all that stuff. And so as a result, at the end of the day, American troops could get where they needed to go. They'd have bullets, they'd have food. Well, usually, except for like Guadalcanal is a different story. We can do a whole podcast on the Battle of Guadalcanal. Honestly, there's so much detail in there, but But yeah, that is really the reason why Japan could never win this war.
And Japan, it doesn't have anything like coal or oil or a lot of natural resources, and a lot of the buildings were even huts at the time. So when they were firebombed, they were just like the villages were just completely incinerated, right?
Yeah. Well, even in their big cities, wood and bamboo was still a primary construction material, unlike, say,
Right.
in Germany, where the buildings were mostly brick and stone.
Mm-hmm. And
They firebombed them anyways, but that's a different story. But yeah, so the Americans actively pursued a firebombing campaign of the Japanese home islands once they had advanced far enough through the Pacific for their B-29s to reach Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, in a single night, the night of March 9th and 10th, into the 10th of 1945, an American firebombing raid over Tokyo destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killed 100,000 people,
Wow.
and left over 1 million people homeless.
This was just this wasn't even the atomic bomb. This is just a firebombing
Yeah,
attack.
and this was in a single night.
Wow.
And this is part of the reason why a lot of people say, that it was horrible, inhumane, cruel to use the atomic bombs on Japan. And some people find this ridiculous, being that I am Japanese, and indeed the Japanese part of my family comes from the Hiroshima area. I had relatives who were killed in that atomic bombing. I still think it was better for Japan and America that the atomic bombs were used.
Yeah.
And thus ending the war more quickly.
Yes, you said that, but I if I could play Satan's advocate, devil's advocate,
FDR's advocate.
FDR's advocate. It wasn't it the case that the U.S. approached Japan like twice in Switzerland to surrender, and they basically wanted surrender with the only condition that the Japanese their only condition was that the emperor not be imprisoned or forced to resign, and didn't that end up happening anyway?
Yeah, so the Japanese, as the war clearly turned against them, they became more and more willing to accept terms to their surrender. But the one issue they would never budge on was the status of the emperor. The emperor was not to be touched. And so the Americans would not have that. They wanted complete unconditional surrender. They wanted to be able to do whatever the fuck they wanted.
Right. So then it's sort of like a domination thing, I guess, to some extent. And like even though they're going to give into that demand of allowing the emperor to stay on anyway, it just sort of is like dominating them completely. So yeah,
the emperor didn't stay on.
Oh, he didn't? I thought he did.
I mean, he wasn't charged with war crimes, but he lost any authority or whatsoever.
True.
He was removed from his position as head of religion and head of state into a completely figurative role.
That's
the
true.
Queen of England has more authority than the Emperor of Japan.
Yeah,
At least she, in theory, on paper, has some sort of authority.
Because
the Emperor of Japan is completely ceremonial.
Because there is an Emperor of Japan today, but to some extent, it was always sort of the generals in Japan and the samurai and such that were, until the samurai were consolidated, it was mostly run by warlords. Anyhow, wasn't it? A shogunate?
Yes. Until it wasn't until I believe the 19th century even that power was consolidated in the emperor, and then you had the whole Meiji Restoration and stuff. But once you get to the time of the World War, you just start seeing these militarist elements within the government starting to wield more and more power.
So I guess to some extent it was going in that direction anyway. And then now, in Japan, you have the debate over rearmament over the current nationalist president Abe.
Go for it, Prime Minister.
Prime Minister, yes. Sorry. Proposing to amend the Constitution to allow rearmament of Japan, which I think will probably have to happen given the expense of the U.S. to pay for its defense, like we see with NATO and the European Union. But it's sort of, I mean, they may eventually rebuild their military anyway, but I guess they're technically prohibited from operating anything other than sort of police subs or police ships. I think it's something.
So, in theory, as the name implies, it is a quote defense force.
Yeah.
But it's so bullshit.
But it's still kind of like a military, right?
they they have one of the most powerful navies in the world.
Oh yeah, like the British Navy you were telling me is a lot less powerful than people have these like illusions of like years ago how it was so powerful.
The Royal Navy has fallen very far.
And yet the Japanese Defense Force actually does have quite a bit of clout. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, they have ships that are as good and in some aspects better than our best. They have a whole line of guided missile destroyers heavily based on the Arleigh Burke class. Mm-hmm. And they have some of the world's most advanced they're not non-nuclear submarines, mm-hmm. but they're some of the most advanced submarines in the world. They have those helicopter destroyer things, which I'm saying with air quotes because they're enormous. It's like the size of like an American amphibious assault ship.
Wow.
But it's a quote destroyer, and I'm sure they must have been thinking about putting the F-35Bs aboard those things even during the design phase. And I am fairly confident that one of these days, provided there isn't massive backlash from the Japanese public, they're going to buy F-35s from us and stick them on these things.
Wow, and that's even more. That's even in some ways more powerful than China, the Navy, right? Or what China currently has.
Well, again, I can get into a whole nother podcast about why Chinese naval aviation is a joke.
Oh, yeah.
Currently. Probably won't be for much longer.
Right.
I assume in the next few decades they're going to make some big strides. Right now it's just like this hilarious joke of like counterfeited Russian boats and planes that are all just full of issues.
Okay, I won't get too off topic with that, but is there anything else you wanted to touch on with the actual attack itself in Pearl Harbor?
One thing a lot of people also know is there actually was a second attack on Pearl Harbor.
Oh, really? Oh, during the war?
On March 4th, 1942, so the Japanese had these flying boats, like big seaplanes they used for reconnaissance mostly. But they had a couple of these and they flew them on this incredibly long mission over to Hawaii as mostly a reconnaissance mission, but also partially just to drop some bombs. They only had two planes. They showed up in the middle of the night. They couldn't see anything. They just dropped their bombs just over the dark blob that was the island. They didn't hit anything. They like broke some windows on private property.
And what year was this? What year was this?
March 42.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, it was the second attack on Pearl Harbor, and nothing happened. Some Japanese planes flew over Hawaii and broke some people's windows.
the Pearl Harbor crapshoot rewind. I believe that was the official name. No. But
I believe it was actually, I think, the longest bombing mission in history up to that point.
Wow. Interesting. What are the 21 swordfish? What are you referring to there?
Oh, the Fairey Swordfish. It was a British torpedo bomber. And
that was on the U.S. side during the Pearl Harbor attack?
No, those are the British used to attack the Italian fleet.
Oh, right. You covered that. Okay. And similarly to the merchant shipbuilding, comparing Japan to the U.S. Production, the aircraft production is also interesting to look at. I have a chart here, and that was also outsized, right? The U.S. was far superior.
Like in any sort of manufacturing or production comparison, you can just see the ridiculous disparity between the American and Japanese sides.
Right.
I mean, during 1943, the United States produced more military aircraft than Japan did during the entire war.
Wow, that's actually pretty impressive. Holy crap! I guess the U.S. took over a lot of factories and was like going full throttle on production, but. Yeah, I mean, Japan probably couldn't have even done that if it had wanted to, because I guess it doesn't have the capacity for that. But
yeah,
does Japan have any coal or anything like that? I don't think so, right?
No, Japan is pretty slim on the natural resources.
I think you've told me something like 80% of the island is uninhabitable because it's mountainous, right? It's like forested, mountainous.
I don't remember the exact figure, but
it's kind of high or something like that. Yeah,
it's not necessarily uninhabitable, but it's not really usable for
if you built
industrialization.
a house on a mountainside, it'd probably be like a mudslide or something. But yeah, I see.
It did work a little to their advantage as the war came to a close, because they started building factories for inside of mountains and stuff.
Right.
But
so
that wasn't going to help them very much.
So you say that for the Arizona, over 1,000 died. The Oklahoma, 400 died. West Virginia, 106 dead. The California, 100 dead. Nevada, 60 dead. Pennsylvania, 9 dead. Tennessee, 5 dead. Maryland, 4 dead. And most of these took like 2 bombs on average.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder why that is. It just like takes one to sort of shock it, and then another to like.
So the statistics I was looking at, they don't specify what sort of bombs they use, because some of the Japanese planes were equipped with general purpose bombs, which would mainly be used to drop on the decks of ships to basically kill the guys using the anti-aircraft guns.
I see.
And but also they had some of their bombers equipped with, they're actually armor-piercing shells they had from some of their battleships that they basically just stuck fins on them and attached them to an airplane and used it as a bomb. And those were designed to punch through the decks of these battleships and blow up deep inside of them, as armor-piercing devices are meant to.
Right.
And so, like, for instance, the Arizona was hit by armor-piercing bombs because it punched down into the magazines, the most heavily armored part of the ship. But I imagine these ones that suffered less damage probably were not hit by these armor-piercing bombs, or if they were, they obviously didn't punch into the more vital areas of the ship. And actually, there's actually a bit of confusion when the attack first started, because they had a couple different plans for if surprise was achieved by the planes as they approached Pearl Harbor, the commander of the strike force would fire a flare out of the cockpit of his plane. One flare would indicate that they had achieved surprise, and therefore the more vulnerable but more dangerous torpedo bombers would go in first, but if they had not achieved surprise, he would fire 2 flares, and then the dive bombers with the general purpose bombs would go in first to try to take out some of the anti-aircraft weapons before the torpedo bombers came in. But when the commander fired off 1 flare, he looked around and saw not everyone was reacting to it, and so he fired off a 2nd flare to make sure everyone would see it. But so some people saw just the 1 flare, and so they went with plan 1, and then some pilots saw both flares and they went with plan 2. So we ended up with most of the planes attacking all at once instead of attacking in sort of 2 distinct groups like that.
I see. And none of the aircraft carriers for the Pacific Fleet were there during the Pearl Harbor attack?
That's correct.
And they just happened not to be there, or was there a reason for that? No good reason.
They just weren't there at the time. They were doing other things.
Oh, really? Yeah, because he moved the entire Pacific Fleet, but I guess that's not considered part of the fleet. Yeah.
I mean, they were part of the fleet, but they weren't. They were out and about doing things.
Right. Was the launching process for aircraft the same? Much different? I think you were saying it's much different back then than it was today, with the aircraft carriers. They use some sort of cable or something?
So today, on American aircraft carriers, at least, use a catapult to launch ships.
Right.
Steam powered on the Nimitz, electromagnetic on the new Ford class carriers. But use a catapult. You hook it to the undercarriage of the aircraft and it'll launch off the front of the ship. But during the World War II era, airplanes didn't weigh anything like what they weigh today, and so they could take off under their own power within the length of a ship.
Oh, I see. Interesting.
But, I mean,
what's that?
Flying planes off a ship is in principle the same.
Yeah, so it's there are some significant differences, but same principle. So what about the blockade of Japan? Was that how was that done?
So a lot of people suggest as this is an alternative to the atomic bombs.
Oh, I see. It was a proposal instead of.
Yeah, but it would prolong the war immensely. It would have exposed the ships to endless kamikaze attacks. I mean, if you look at the statistics for kamikaze attacks, I mean, during like the invasion of Okinawa and stuff, it's pretty bad. If you tried to blockade the entire home island Japan for possibly years, it would be massive casualties for the Americans. In addition to the fact that the unbelievable suffering you'd impose on the entire population of Japan by trying to starve them out.
Right.
My argument for using the atomic bombs, it was actually the most humane thing to do.
Because it didn't starve all these people.
Well, your options are starving them all out, burning them to death slowly with fire bombs.
Right.
Invading Japan, which not only would kill huge numbers of Americans, but like essentially like every last man, woman, and child in Japan was instructed to fight to the death.
Right.
They had essentially like these neighborhood militias, or whatever they'd organize, where they'd practice to attack the invading Americans with bamboo spears.
Wow.
So it would have been just huge civilian and military casualties in an invasion.
Do you know how many people died?
My argument is, in fact, the atomic bombs were indeed the most humane way to do it. For example, it probably would have killed less people than any of the other options, and they also died a lot faster. Instead of slowly burning to death, slowly starving to death, or being shot to death.
Yeah, do you know how many civilians died in the Japanese firebombing and how many civilians died in Japan during the war?
So the statistics range for total civilian deaths in Japan from bombing is 300 to 500,000,
right.
Of which roughly 120 to 160,000 were from the two atomic bombs.
I see. So there actually weren't too many civilians that died other than the atomic bombs? Or no, there's
still the atomic bombs account for less than half.
Oh, I see. Yeah, but that's still actually a lot from the atomic bombs. I wouldn't have expected that, but because the firebombing seems so brutal. But I guess those are populous cities. So I know in Iraq 50,000 died in civilian casualties, and I was surprised to learn that. But that's interesting.
Collateral damage.
Collateral damage. Right. Yeah, that's what this was too. And do you have any statistics about the kamikaze attacks? That was a thing where basically they were told to sacrifice their lives, and it's just a suicide mission, right?
Yeah. So kamikaze is actually a mistranslation of the characters in the word. It would actually be read a special attack squadron, I believe.
Oh, really? So it was more like a military thing rather than like a Shinto thing, or what we sometimes pictured as.
Our ideas about it are essentially correct. It's just we get the translation of the name wrong, or the pronunciation of the name wrong. It's actually read. It's not read kamikaze. It's read a different way. It doesn't mean divine wind. It means special attack squadron.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. I've heard that divine wind thing, but I guess that's not true. What is Tora? Wasn't that just like a thing that they shouted?
That was just the code word they used over the radio to announce the start of the attack.
It wasn't an announcement of converting to Judaism. Yeah, it's spelled different. I've spelled differently. I've heard that Tora. Yeah, it's just announcing that they were attacking, right?
Yes.
I see. And part of Japan was not part of Japan. I guess Hokkaido, the U.S. was threatening to invade the northern island of Hokkaido, but they never actually did, right?
They were?
Or the Soviet Union invaded.
Soviet Union was invading the Kuril Islands.
Manchuria, and parts of northern Japan.
Yeah.
And well, not the U.S., but the Allied forces were talking about invading Hokkaido, right? And that's part of
the Americans did conduct some bombing operations in the northern reaches of Japan to get the Japanese to think they might invade up there, so they'd have to redeploy some forces up there.
Yeah.
But I've not heard of any serious plans to invade the north of Japan.
I think
the actual plans drawn up for the invasion of the home islands, Operation Olympic, I believe, would be from the south.
Oh, I see. They actually weren't planning on. Were they considering invading Okinawa? However,
they did invade Okinawa.
Oh, they did. Yeah, I didn't know that, but they actually. That was a strategic point, right? Because it's an island like very close to Japan.
Yeah.
And was there a lot who died?
And also, it is also considered part of the Japanese home islands.
Yeah,
even though there is like their own ethnic group that actually lives there, but.
Yeah, but did a lot die in that?
Yeah, Okinawa was unbelievably bloody.
There's corpses everywhere, like thousands. Or how many people live there? Like a million.
Let me pull up some statistics real quick. Battle of Okinawa. Let's see. American losses: 14 to 20,000 killed. Somewhere between 40 to 55,000 wounded. Japanese. Somewhere between 77 and 110,000 Japanese soldiers killed, and somewhere in the range of 100,000 or more civilians killed as well. Some estimates go up to 300. Let's see. Okay, estimated up to 150,000 out of the approximately 300,000 civilians living there were killed.
Oh my God!
And actually, quite a lot of them killed themselves because the Japanese government had spread this horrible propaganda that the American soldiers were these animals. They would beat and rape and torture any civilian they got their hands on.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people killed themselves, and even women would kill their children and they hold their babies and jump off a cliff with them and stuff just to save them from these horrible American monsters.
Wow. Sounds like Asian Greece or something. And it's just because, like you were saying, it was people committed suicide and they were like desperate to defend one of their home islands, so that's why there were just so many casualties. It was also a strategic point, I guess.
Yeah, and this was also part of the Japanese strategy. They intended to make every inch as bloody as they could possibly make it to get the Americans to back down. And there were anything they could to get any kind of pushback against the U.S. to get some sort of chips on the negotiating table.
Did you say that the home islands were pretty well fortified? In what way were they fortified? Did they have like land, or did they have ocean? Was it mined, and were there like huge gun defenses and things like that?
It's somewhat off topic, but actually the Japanese weren't really that into mines. Didn't do very much mining.
Then what were like their defenses like? Were they?
They had as in Okinawa and other places, they had very thorough. Tunnels and trenches and stuff dug into the terrain.
I see.
These deep into the mountainside and stuff that would be really difficult to clear out. And they also had sort of held back a lot of their best equipment and a lot of their best troops in reserve and in the home islands in anticipation of an invasion. So at least initially, the defending Japanese forces would be better equipped and supplied than a lot of the forces the Americans have been fighting up to that point.
That's interesting.
In fact, actually, it's after a while of these horrific bloody battles, having to dig the Japanese out of every little hole from under every rock on some of these islands. They resorted to. They made big use of flamethrowers to just pour fire down these tunnels.
Wow.
Even if the soldiers' side didn't burn to death, they'd suffocate.
The Americans did this to the Japanese?
Yeah.
Wow.
And actually, some within the U.S. military proposed to use poison gas as a more humane alternative to flamethrowers.
Yeah, because I think
that's how you know you're doing some gritty stuff when poison gas can be considered a humane alternative to something.
Yeah, because I think poison gas was against the Geneva Convention after World War I, and I guess if they're considering using that anyway, maybe Japan didn't sign it, but I don't know.
Yeah, also there was like international like condemnation of using napalm. But the U.S. was like, nah, we like this stuff too much.
They could have put Elon Musk out of business with his flamethrower, but
I think it's just like a propane barbecue, though. It's not like jellied petroleum.
Right. That's much worse.
I say, actual incendiary napalm. It's not just a flame. It's like a jelly. It's sticky. It flows.
Right. It's like a molten type of thing.
Yeah. It's not just gonna burn off your shirt. It's gonna burn through your shirt and into your arm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
while we're on that topic, also freaking white phosphorus munitions. Oh God. They're supposedly supposed to be used, even to this day, the U.S. still uses white phosphorus munitions. In theory, it's illegal to use them for anything but creating smoke, because they do create a lot of smoke, but they also burn incredibly hot. And so if it gets on your arm, like, it will burn straight through your arm and drop through the other side. Like, it's horrific stuff.
That sounds nasty.
I think there were a couple incidents, I think during the Iraq War, where the U.S. military used white phosphorus munitions in urban environments. So it's debated as to whether or not they were intentionally using it for its more nefarious purpose, or were actually just trying to put up a smoke screen. But
I see.
That's getting off topic.
Yeah. So we could go into.
I got so into talking about burning people to death.
Hitler Softy, no. No, so we could go into, the cruelty of the Japanese and their camps, but maybe that would be better for another podcast. But is there anything else you wanted to say about this particular topic of Pearl Harbor?
FDR is a jackass.
For imprisoning your people, yes. He singled out the Japanese.
Just like shitting on the Constitution. People think Trump is bad. Oh.
Yeah, FDR. Yeah, he was like this communist, basically, who ran for 4 terms. That's a long time to be in power. He was like a semi-dictator.
And then God saw fit to give him a brain hemorrhage.
He died when he was banging some former mistress, I think.
Yeah,
and
because Harry Truman wasn't really any better. Harry Truman was a real jackass too.
And then he took over at the end of World War II.
As far as I can tell, Harry Truman hated every sort of religious and ethnic group that wasn't the same as him.
In fact, I have a quote from him right here. This is the romantic quote that he sent to his wife. "I think one man is just as good as another, as long as he's honest and decent and not an N-word or a Chinaman. Uncle Wills," I guess that's his uncle, "says that the Lord made a white man from dust, a N-word from mud, and then threw what was left of him, and it came down to Chinaman. He does hate the Chinese and Japs. So do I. It is race prejudice, I guess, but I am strongly of the opinion that Negroes ought to be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white men in Europe and America." Well, that's not so controversial, but the first part was.
Yeah. So that was a personal letter to his wife, I believe.
Yeah, that was a.
I also have another Harry Truman quote, which is, "My wife has never let a Jew step into her house before, and I'm not going to start today." This is after he was president. I believe there was some journalist basically following around for a day, interviewing him. At the end of the day, he suggested, how about we go back to your place and show me around? And he said, yeah, my wife has never let a Jew step foot into our home, and it's not about to start today.
What a romantic. He had such a way with words.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do the bit, Dems are the real racists, but it kind of does apply here, so. But anyway.
We like Ike.
But anyway, I think that's where I'll finish up this podcast. We'll be talking about World War II and a few other topics later on.
That's all I'm good for around here.
World War II. But yeah, happy Pearl Harbor Day. If it wasn't happy, but whatever.
Yeah.
If you like this,
have a respectful Pearl Harbor Day. Remember those who gave their lives for their country.
Yep. And
lower that flag outside. Half staff all day. Don't forget.
I'm already full staff. But anyway, if you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe, and thank you for listening.